I'm Adélie Pojzman-Pontay, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we continue to unpack NATO's response to the incursion of 19 Russian drones into Polish airspace. We also hear the latest news from the resistance in the Ukrainian territories occupied by Russia. And we zoom in on the water crisis in Donetsk.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Thursday, the 11th of September, 3 years and 201 days since the full-scale invasion began. Today, I'm joined by Associate Defence Editor Dom Nicholls, Brussels Correspondent Joe Barnes, and Dr. Jade McGlynn of King's College London.
Thanks, Adélie. Hello, everyone. So this is that nexus between military and political stories, the continued fallout and repercussions of those drone incursions into Polish airspace. So Poland's foreign minister said yesterday that these overnight incursion of several Russian drones, I think 19 was the number we settled on, into NATO's airspace was not an accidental event. So this is Radoslaw Sikorski. He said, "We have no doubt that this was not an accidental event. We are dealing with an unprecedented case of an attack not only on Poland's territory, but also on the territory of NATO and the European Union." Mr. Sikorski said that Russian drones had veered into Polish airspace before, but that this time the situation was quite different. He said when one or two drones does it, it's possible it was a technical malfunction, i.e. implying that when you get 19 across quite a number of different sites up and down the country, some quite far north, very far north actually, it is not, in his view, an accident. Now, yesterday morning, the North Atlantic Council, that's NATO's political decision-making committee, met after Poland requested Article 4 consultation. So everyone talks about Article 5 being the mutual defence clause. Article 4 is just the formal mechanism of trying to get the alliance together to discuss an issue. It had last been used at the start of the full-scale invasion. But Article 4 was invoked yesterday, and there was this meeting. So diplomats and officials decided that the incident was not severe enough to merit an Article 5 action. An alliance source speaking to us, the Telegraph, said we should see this for what it appears to be, not an attack. Interesting view. A second source said allies were buoyed that they had successfully seen off the first direct Russian threat to NATO in its 76-year history, which you might say those two statements don't necessarily sit alongside each other particularly well. The second source said things had worked out as they should. We responded quickly and with resolve. I'm not so sure. Anyway, elsewhere, yesterday the E5 met in London. Speaking alongside his fellow defence ministers, John Healey, Britain's defence secretary, branded Russia's actions dangerous, reckless and unprecedented. He said they had reached a new level of hostility against Europe. He said, "We saw across NATO's eastern border a serious violation of Polish airspace, deep enough for Warsaw Airport to be closed and NATO jets to shoot down Russian drones in what is the first defensive action of its kind since Vladimir Putin launched his full-scale attack on Ukraine." Reaffirming the alliance's commitment to help protect Ukraine, he said the UK must look at options to bolster NATO's protection of Poland's airspace. He said Putin was testing us. So all these statements are slightly at odds with each other. That is the messy thing about democracy, but something as serious as this, you would have thought they'd be maybe slightly closer aligned. Anyway, other work by colleagues here. The Telegraph understands John Healey, as I said, Britain's Defence Secretary, has instructed the military here to explore dispatching RAF Typhoon jets to police the skies above Eastern Europe, or possibly a Sky Sabre missile battery from the Royal Artillery, along with its ground-based radar. The Defence Secretary said he had asked Britain's armed forces to, quote, look at options to bolster NATO's air defence over Poland. This comes after Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer told his Polish counterpart that Britain stood ready to support NATO and Poland to continue to defend the alliance in the coming days and weeks. Britain had recalled one of its 6 Sky Sabre air defence systems from Poland late last year after it had spent almost 3 years protecting the Eastern European country. Poland, you'll remember, is the West's main logistic hub for shipments of vital military aid going into Ukraine. Now, the RAF has in the past contributed several Typhoon jets to the NATO air policing mission out of Malbork Air Base in northern Poland. That's where the Dutch F-35s were scrambled from late on Tuesday. But this would be out of sequence if the British sent any more jets there. It's not part of the NATO air policing mission. This would be a direct response. Now, Donald Trump, he reacted to the violation of Polish airspace by posting on his Truth Social site, "What's with Russia violating Poland's airspace with drones? Here we go." That was before the murder of Charlie Kirk, the Conservative influencer and key ally of Mr. Trump's. So perhaps Donald Trump's attention was diverted elsewhere, and we may not hear much more in the next day or so from him about these drones. Now, Kurt Volker, who's a former US ambassador to NATO, he was interviewed on the BBC Radio 4 Today programme this morning. He said that NATO has many options to respond to what he said was a deliberate incursion into NATO territory. He called for an extended air defence zone, something that we have talked about many times on this podcast in the past, including yesterday. Mr. Volker said anything within 200 kilometres of the border should be engaged. He said NATO deliberately avoiding saying it had been an attack was an effort to avoid an escalatory dynamic, he said, but there can't be any other explanation. He said such a thing as in an extended air defence zone would be appropriate and proportionate because manned Russian aircraft don't get that close to the border. So any action by NATO would only be shooting down drones, just technology, no loss of life is the idea. He said we shouldn't be worried about Russian sensitivities as they're attacking us. And on the practical ability of NATO to defend itself, he wasn't so worried. He said the principle is that once you see this happening, you organise and prepare for it. Poland didn't expect it but acted quickly. And knowing now that this is a possibility from Russia, that this is something Russia may do, NATO has the ability to increase its capabilities in a number of ways. So that's the kind of big picture stuff, the response so far to the drone incursion. But to get the view from the ground in Poland, I'd like to say thank you to a listener in Warsaw who sent us an email at ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. Sent the email yesterday as the drone incursions were first being reported. Our listener, who's given us permission to read this, says, "I'm sat at my desk," so this was written yesterday, you'll remember. "I'm sat at my desk in the financial district on the 28th floor looking out of the centre of Warsaw. As I write this, I travelled in by train and metro this morning, as I often do. The atmosphere is not like it was in February 22. I'll never forget the silence on the metro that day. Everyone glued to their phones, the sense of fear and uncertainty. When the missile landed in Poland in late 2022, there was a strong fear then too. Most people are a bit unsettled by it today, but there's no hint of panic, and there is a sense that the military can handle these kind of incursions. I'm keen to find out if they were armed or decoys. As a side note, we think they were mostly decoys, the Gerber drones. Anyway, our listener continues, my colleague was laughing about the alert we both received saying not to touch downed drones. It seems the whole country got this. He attached a screenshot of the alert the government sent out with a translation to all on mobile phones. The listener continues, I'm happy they were shot down. Romania has been too passive about stuff landing on their side of the border, and the Russians have responded by being more careless. I think most Poles are of the opinion that the Russians are provoked by weakness and respect strength and are happy with a strong response. For now, I'd say it's surreal how normal everything feels, given that it looks like we came under direct attack last night. I guess the frog has been boiled. We're not shocked anymore. Best regards, from our lovely listener in Warsaw. So thank you for that. I thought it was particularly interesting about that comment about the nationwide alert. There's been a number of tests lately. We had one in the UK at the weekend. All our phones started buzzing with a note from the government testing the emergency response. Obviously, it wasn't a test yesterday in Poland, but I think Germany has tested similar technology this morning. The Bundestag, we're told, was interrupted as the alerts went out. I'd be interested to know if anyone else around Europe or elsewhere has in the last week, if their governments have sent out any tests for emergency response or air alert or what have you. On the ground then in Ukraine, Again, not a lot of movement. A bit of ground changed hands in both directions, actually, just to the west of Konstantinivka, but that's about it. 66 drones fired in the last 24 hours by Russia, Ukraine. 4 got through. A school and cathedral were hit in the city of Sumy in the north. 3 people killed across the country, others injured. A couple of wider stories, Adélie. A Ukrainian military intelligence drone from the HUR, from the HUR, hit a multifunctional vessel of the Russian Black Sea Fleet off Novorossiysk yesterday, inflicting costly damage. This comes from the HUR. So the Project MPSV-07 ship was tracked and hit while carrying out reconnaissance and patrolling Novorossiysk Bay. That's in the Krasnodar, or just off the Krasnodar region of Russia, where the Black Sea Fleet is based, having been pushed out of Crimea. So the HUR released black and white footage of what they say is a domestically produced aerial drone hitting the ship's bridge. In a statement, they said, as a result of the strike, the Russian vessel's electronic intelligence systems were destroyed and the ship was disabled and sent for costly repairs. Kyiv Independent reporting there. Connected to that, a communications tower has been destroyed at an air defence factory in the Russian city of Tula, about 300 k's north of Ukraine, 180 k's-ish south of Moscow. This comes from the pro-Ukrainian Artesh partisan group, claiming it this morning. In a statement, they said, this is an enterprise of the Russian military-industrial complex. It develops air defence systems, rapid-fire guns and small arms. In particular, the factory workshops assemble the Kornet anti-tank missile system and the Pantsir S air defence missile system. Artesh Group, you'll remember, regularly conducts sabotage operations on military infrastructure in occupied Ukrainian territory and deep within Russia. I think we got more from this type of activity from regular contributor and friend of the pod, Jade McGlynn, later today. A couple more from me, Adélie. Britain's MOD says that in a first-of-its-kind industrial partnership, the UK and Ukraine are going to be sharing detailed designs for air defence drones along with other equipment. So this first joint project's been announced by the Defence Secretary at the DSEI Defence Trade Show in London, Defence Security Expo International, I think it stands for. Going to confirm the UK production of a Ukrainian-designed drone. The new air defence interceptor drone is going to be called Project Octopus. It's going to be mass-produced in the UK with a target to produce thousands per month to provide to Ukraine. The first drone developed under this Project Octopus is said to have been designed by Ukraine with support from UK scientists and technicians. And, so the government press release says, so you've got to have a health warning there, I suppose. They say it's already proved successful on the battlefield, proving highly effective against Shahed drones. Now, earlier this week, a couple of things to bring you up to date with. The Defence Secretary hosted his Ukrainian counterpart, Denis Shmyhal, and other European defence ministers in London for the latest meeting of the Ukraine Defence Contact Group, the Ramstein Group, as it's known. That's the 50-nation-strong group dedicated to providing military support for Ukraine. It's now co-led by the UK and Germany. You'll remember after the US slightly stepped back. During that meeting, Mr Healey confirmed the UK-led International Fund for Ukraine had passed £2 billion in funding commitments from the UK and 11 other countries. News from last night, $400 million US dollars allocated under the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative. That's the Pentagon-led program that supplies arms to Ukraine through contracts with US defence companies. That's been passed. That's part of an $890 billion US dollar defence bill that was passed yesterday by the US House of Representatives.
Thanks, Dom. Let's bring in Joe Barnes now, our Brussels correspondent. Joe, you've been covering the unfolding story of the drone incursions from Brussels. Tell us what the mood is over there and what have you been hearing?
Yeah, so I say I've been covering it from the coalface. I think what's interesting is, well, first of all, the spokesman for SHAPE, which is basically NATO's military headquarters, came out and said, well, this is the first time that we have engaged a potential threat inside Allied airspace in the Alliance's 76-year history. Sorry, it's April 4th, I think, the NATO birthday is essentially. So a potential threat. But why was it only Article 4 and not Article 5? I guess the perceived nature of this, that this wasn't actually an armed attack, which is sort of needed for an Article 5 sort of incident. The only time Article 5 is triggered is after 9/11 terror attacks in New York and Washington. So from the people I spoke to in NATO, they were quite happy with how everything had gone. Essentially, what they'd done is they had seen off whatever it was. They didn't deem it to be an attack. I'll get to sort of some theories around what it could have been. They had seen off whatever it was with minimal fuss. No one was injured. They managed to bring together 2 Dutch F-35 aircraft, 2 Polish F-16s, a few Polish helicopters, a Italian AWACS early warning surveillance aircraft, and then on the ground, his missiles weren't used, but I'm presuming his radar, ground-based radar, was a German Patriot battery. So actually, the first time that after decades and decades and decades of NATO military planners trying to draw together potential plans and strategies for what actually happens if we are attacked or something happens like this, what do we do? Actually turned out those plans work. And I think that was the resounding feeling. Basically, apparently, when the North Atlantic Council met, there was lots of sort of condemnation for the incident. Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, came out and called Russia and the incursion reckless afterwards. And I think including Donald Tusk in his language yesterday, he said, look, we're not on the verge of war yet. So even the Poles were sort of saying, yes, look, it's a problem, it's really bad, but it's not that top level of escalation. And again, people just thought that means the system worked. NATO did its job and people were happy about that. I think the other thing is people were also happy with the diplomatic side of things, essentially. The military response, great, drones downed, no one injured, no one died, came off without hitch. But then you had proof that NATO's decision-making sort of bodies work well, and the fact that actually the idea that it's a consensus-based organisation meant that after this was resolved without incident, it didn't escalate into something that nobody really wants. And I think we can all agree none of us really want a war with Russia. And most likely Russia doesn't want a war with NATO because it would be bad news for everyone. Interest on the ground. You look at theories to what was actually happening, and it was probably a testing or probing exercise from Putin. Lots of European ministers put this as their first allegation. And essentially was Putin testing how much he can get away with? Because Article 5 is level of strategic ambiguity around, but that means Putin doesn't know what it means. So he now knows that he can sort of fly some potentially decoy drones into Poland, can interrupt air traffic. Rzeszów Airport, one of the main, or probably the main hub for Ukraine military aid, was disrupted for several hours without triggering such a Article 5 scenario. So he's learnt that. NATO's learnt that its sort of protocols work. So I think everyone can come away from it happy that it didn't escalate from there. But I will stop there for now.
Yes, thanks, Joe. You say Article 4 and the mechanisms within NATO have been successful. It's basically constantly redefining the threshold of how we respond and whether that constitutes an attack. What do you think, based on what has been decided from the drone incursion, is the new threshold? Radoslav Sikorski from Poland said it was an attack in the first place. Then NATO decided it wasn't an attack. What is the threshold where we're deciding that it is an attack based on this new precedent then?
Might be slightly controversial, but I'm not as uppity as some of it. And I see why politicians are doing this, because it plays well politically for them. Look, we're in a situation where we are preparing for a Russian attack. We're trying to rearm and up spending to our militaries. We're trying to increase preparedness for a situation at a sort of record speed since the Cold War. Mark Rutte actually spells this out quite eloquently. He says, as a politician, we need to prepare our people for the fact that increased defence spending likely comes away from budgets for schools, for hospitals and for other civilian things. For people hamming up the incursion into Poland, it plays well for them because they say, look, actually, that's an example of why we need to prepare and why we need to spend money. This is why taxes might have to go up. This is why we're diverting funds away from your children's school or your elderly grandparents or elderly parents' health and social care, etc., because we need to bolster our armed forces, our militaries, to meet this potential threat head on one day. So I think it plays well for the politicians to basically ham it up and go further than it is. As for redefining the definition of what constitutes an attack, I think they probably see this in the grey area, sort of the hybrid warfare. So similar to a cyber attack or something like that, which we know happens quite frequently. Russia, Iran, North Korea, other sort of bad actors, or often China, are often blamed for them. And they've never sort of seen Article 5, well, definitely not seen Article 5 triggered. So I think that is what people are sort of judging this decision maker, the policy makers, are judging this to actually be, rather than a full-blown attack.
Thanks, Ellie. A couple of thoughts. NATO Article 5. Bluff. Bottom line up front, we don't know. The only time it's ever been invoked was after 9/11, and not by the United States, as many people think. It was actually by the North Atlantic Council. It did then lead to a response by the alliance, but it is not technically correct to say the US is the only country to have ever invoked Article 5. But as Joe's been saying, Article 5 doesn't instantly mean everyone piles out the barracks and starts shooting things. It may or may not lead to a commitment to deploy military force. And then what does that mean? That doesn't automatically mean tanks and all the rest of it. It could be other types of military activity. So there's already, once you dig into Article 5, it is not an absolute given that people start rushing east. And then, as many of the commentators have spoken of, and certainly Jens Stoltenberg did when he was NATO Secretary General, I think Mark Rutte may have done as well. In fact, I'm pretty sure he has. The long conversation about, well, what does Article 5 mean for an attack in cyberspace or in actual space? At what point do you cross the threshold such that it's an armed attack? What does that mean? Now, this ambiguity around it can be useful because it means Russia doesn't know what NATO will think and do. There's no template, there's no automatic response. If you do that, we will do this. So ambiguity can be useful. It can also be not very useful at all when something like this occurs and nobody knows where the edges are, and these conversations are happening in real time and in public against a clamour for what are you going to do about drones if they come over tonight or tomorrow night or next week. So the short answer is we don't know. We've never really been faced with a similar situation to this before. So whether or not this is Article 4, Article 5, whether or not that's seen as a weak response or a usefully ambiguous response, or as Kurt Volker said this morning on the radio, actually from a standing start, you could say Poland and the alliance ponied up a response that was good enough on the day. Of course, the Russian Milblog community have gone bonkers saying this was a humiliation of NATO and all the rest of it. I mean, ignore that. Just look at what actually happened. It is very, very difficult to say whether or not this crosses a threshold of an armed attack, whether or not this means Article 5 should be invoked every time a drone comes over the border. Even if you do invoke Article 5, what that actually means in practical terms. It doesn't always mean that everyone just starts getting on the body armour and rushing out the barracks, as I said. So, a lot of ambiguity, which is why we discuss these things. And it's as important to understand where the edges are, the soft, fudgy edges, as much as the actual hard policy. I hope that clears some of it up.
That does clear some of it up. Joe, in your piece that we will link to in the show notes, you said that there are mounting warnings that Russia will be ready to attack NATO 5 years after the war in Ukraine comes to an end. Can you talk us through that line of thinking?
I think Mark Rutte said when he came to do a Chatham House event earlier this year, said Russia could be ready to attack NATO within 5 years. As he was basically trying to big up the idea of we should move to 5% as the floor for defence spending. The Danish defence intelligence people have also been using this 5 years. The German defence intelligence chief, he earlier warned this year that it could be ready within 4 years. And basically what they're referring to is Russia is undergoing a complete change to its economy. It's moved on to a war footing, and it is rearming, people claim, at such a rate that they think by sort of 2030, it will be ready to attack NATO. I think most level-headed people seem to suggest, and when you speak to analysts, that is dependent on the war in Ukraine coming to an end, because that then gives them time to actually focus on the task of rearmament rather than trying to fight. And that is what essentially Europe is preparing for. The EU has this thing called Readiness 2030, and it basically is trying to get a load of metrics, whether it be civilian things like hospitals or bomb shelters and stuff like that, ready. And it is trying to do this within that framework as well. So that's where that comment in my piece comes from.
Thank you. And my last question to you today. The drone incursion happened on the week that the Zapad exercise with Belarus is starting again. I believe that's starting on Friday. Can you talk us through what that means and how that context shapes that incursion?
Yeah, so Poland was quick to announce the drones that entered its territory all originated from Belarus. Zapad, for those who don't know, is a massive sort of war game that's held annually by Russian and Belarusian forces. I think Donald Tusk yesterday warned it's essentially a preparation, or at least practices, what a Russian attack on NATO would look like via the Suwalki Gap. That's that sort of thin strip of territory which runs from Kaliningrad all the way to Belarus. It is sort of seen as the Achilles heel of NATO, potentially the most likely place for a Russian incursion, actually a ground-based incursion. because if you break through that and manage to get a reasonable distance, you can cut off the Baltics and stuff like that. So it'd be bad news. And sort of, if you wanted to take a sliver of territory from NATO, that would be sort of the best fought out position. Well, that's at least what people fear. So even before the drone incursion, nerves are a bit jangly. Poland already decided it was going to shut its border with Belarus. There were some pictures circulated this morning. I haven't been able to verify them. It looked like Poland was sending a deterrence force of some nature, including sort of armed vehicles and artillery, maybe tanks, closer to its frontier with Belarus. So that exercise, which is held every year, yeah, it's got enough nerves jangling.
And now we turn to Dr. Jade McGlynn for the latest updates on the resistance.
I sort of feel like I have to talk about the water crisis that's happening in the occupied territories, which has become especially severe in Donetsk region. I'm going to start with sort of what's been happening in Mariupol, where publicly many people have been sharing, pictures, for example, of the Starokrimske reservoir, which keeps on drying up. And there are some very alarming pictures from there which show that it's been almost completely exhausted. It's able to meet around a fifth of the city's needs per day. In principle, this could mean a halt almost totally in water supply to Mariupol by the second quarter of 2026. Naturally, the occupation authorities have been introducing sort of water outage schedules. It must be said, not in a particularly organised fashion. So there was a 2-day water outage schedule where they'd turn off the water sort of for 2 days and then it'd be on the third day. But the local sort of occupation administration in Mariupol then received an order from the Donetsk regional occupation administration that no, they should be ensuring uninterrupted water supply, in particular to mortgage housing construction sites. So those are sites that are being sold off to people from Russia or to people who are able to afford them, which are not the locals, and being sold off to Russians at ridiculously low interest rates, suspiciously low interest rates, not the sort of interest rates one would get in Russia in any case. I think it's pretty fair to say that would suggest that the implementation of the schedule of sort of when water is provided is very much a political as much as a technical decision. In any case, it ended up being pretty much technically impossible. And so what ended up happening has been, over recent weeks, the city's not been cutting off water comprehensively, but sort of manually by districts. People are very unhappy. There have even been a series of protest actions in the central district of Mariupol against the water outages, largely elderly ladies, though of course the population in the occupied territories does skew heavily towards pensioners. Eventually, it appears the occupation authorities in Mariupol decided to just ignore Pushilin, who's the head of the so-called Donetsk People's Republic, regarding the water supply schedules. From a consumption perspective, the situation in Mariupol remains critical. People that I'm speaking to compare it, however, favourably to Donetsk, where social sentiments are, arguably no longer under control, and where sources have come today, sources involved in children's education, children's safeguarding inside the occupied areas, have confirmed outbreaks of cholera inside Donetsk because of the very egregious hygiene situation, bluntly, because of course people, and forgive me, because I think I've discussed this before and I don't normally like to discuss toilets quite so often in public, but of course people are unable to flush their toilets, and then that leads to issues. So we have essentially a real breakdown of, I suppose, basic civilizational standards in the city of Donetsk. The residents of Donetsk in particular have been quite actively voicing complaints about these chronic water shortages and the unfair distribution. So both the technical infrastructural failure that is obvious from the Russian occupation, but also the very unfair and politicized distribution, both on local kind of Telegram channels and chats, but also directly to the occupiers, to the sort of local collaborators. Like Vladimir Putin in December holds that sort of direct line, conference where he just talks for like 4 hours about all manner of things. Pushilin, who's the head of the so-called Donetsk People's Republic, the Gauleiter, I suppose, of the so-called Donetsk People's Republic, he sometimes holds these direct lines on social media. And in this particular case, it was on August 19th. He took over 600 questions, and the vast, vast majority of them were about the chronic lack of water, about the missed delivery schedules, providing certain water. And he promised more water trucks. He promised sort of thousands of water tanks in basements. But ultimately, everything that he suggested so far, some of which have been quite bizarre efforts, such as using disused mines to sort of sift out water, which does not sound like particularly appetizing water, to be honest with you. But he's now openly said, well, no, that didn't work. The only thing that they say will work would be for them to conquer Slavyansk and the Seversky Donetsk sort of canal basin, which would require not just conquering Slavyansk, but also conquering quite large swathes of Kharkiv region. And bluntly, given the pace that Russia is advancing, which is a very, very slow one, that's not something that's likely to be occurring anytime soon. But it shows as well, this constant issue inside Russia, and anywhere where Russia imposes its rule is just the absolute lack of accountability. And if there are problems, that's for ordinary people to live with. They'll make sure that elites or collaborators or, imposed sort of settler colonialists are sorted. And they won't fix it, and they'll just find somebody else to blame. In this case, it's Ukraine. Ukraine is to blame for having the temerity to defend itself. But yes, I think this is something definitely worth watching, particularly with the reports of cholera outbreak in the city, which so far have been confirmed by one source, but it's only one source, so we have to be careful. But I'm sure we'll hear more in the coming days. I have to say, based on what is very publicly available about the situation of water in Donetsk, in the city of Donetsk, it would not be that shocking a development.
You say it's one source. What's the scale? Is that one case, or what's the scale of the outbreak at this stage that we know?
Yes, maybe I should be careful saying outbreak. Essentially, it's been more than one case. We don't have the exact number of cases, but it's reported in a spike of cholera in schools and in nurseries. All of those areas, of course, where I'm not a pathologist, I have to be careful talking too much about cholera. It's not something I'm familiar with because, it's that sort of infection that you just think it belongs to the past, certainly not to what was before 2014 and indeed before 2022, a very modern, and developed city in Europe.
Have there been any reported cases of deaths?
No, not to my knowledge. And of course, there is going to be attempts to cover this up. I'd be shocked if there weren't.
What do the locals do faced with the water shortages?
So a lot of it is life, I suppose what we would call life hacks. Just sharing tips has become much more common, let's say on Telegram, letting people know when water is available, reminiscent, I suppose, to some of the Soviet queues towards the end of the Soviet Union. Water is available to buy, but it's expensive. People who are selling it are not willing to sell at a loss as such because it's all imported, because, of course, it's a very unnatural position that the occupied territories are in. They've been sort of cut off. And although in theory, they've obviously been cut off from the country that they are legally a part of, but also, although the Russians say there isn't a border, and technically there is not a border between Russia and the occupied territories, in practice, with the exception of Crimea, there very much is a border, and particularly for customs and for people, which is essentially everything. So it's very difficult to resolve it, I suppose, through market forces, especially when you're dealing with a pretty sclerotic market economy anyway in Russia.
Is there any knowledge of any aid that manages to get to them? I mean, I assume not.
No, because naturally, because of the sanctions situation, because of the fact that they are under a very brutal Russian occupation, it's essentially impossible for the vast majority of Western organisations or NGOs or governments to engage at all in the occupied territories. The International Committee of the Red Cross is supposed to have some presence, but I think it's fair to say that there have been numerous questions about the efficacy of their actions and the support they've been able to provide in relation to Russia and Ukraine. There are some very small organisations who provide humanitarian aid from Russia, but very, very few. Firstly, because voluntary work is not really a tradition in Russia in the same way as it might be somewhere, and charity. It's not to say it doesn't exist, it does. It's not as well developed. Secondly, most people just do not know that this is happening in the occupied territories. I recently compiled report on, or sort of, well, it wasn't really a report, just a section of a report on Russian coverage of the occupied territories for Russians, so for domestic Russian audiences, not for the occupied territories. If you watch it, and everything there is great, apart from a few Ukrainian partisans.
who obviously the FSB finds straight away within 1 minute of them even considering anything. I mean, it's just your typical sort of, it's very, very basic, not particularly sophisticated propaganda. So I don't think that people would have an idea. In general, the narrative is, wow, look how much better life has got for the people in the occupied territories, these backwards people who now they get to be connected to, this great and developed Russia, which clearly is not consistent with the facts, to put it very mildly. And yet that's the narrative that prevails, and it's very difficult to find any evidence that people are not taking that narrative at face value. That doesn't mean that they are. It's just people would have no reason to question it. And it does feed into a general, very widespread sort of Russian sense of collective narcissism and greatness.
Thank you, Jade. What are the other resistance updates from this week?
So I'll very quickly just provide an update for between the 14th and the 27th of August, just because we missed it. During this period, we noted 14 different resistance activities. For example, in Melitopol, which is a city in occupied Zaporizhia, there was destruction. They burnt an occupation official's car. In Novokakhovka, there was an assassination of an FSB official. There were numerous sabotage activities on the railways, as always, and certainly that we've seen a spike in these. Interestingly, some of these were in Luhansk, where we tend to see them less. And we also saw a spike in the number of assassinations. Interestingly, one that happened on the 18th of August, reported by Mariupol Resistance, happened in Polohi in Zaporizhia region. That is very much an area where the Russians are sending a lot of equipment and is a real, touch point in terms of any offensive in that area, or any enhanced efforts, maybe, rather than a separate offensive. Similarly, in Kirillivka, around a similar area in Zaporizhia region, there was an assassination of a Russian military official. It was interesting, essentially, just because there were notably more assassinations during this time period, but it does appear to be linked to Russian reinforcement. Similarly, there have been reinforcements of equipment and soldiers to Kherson, the occupied parts of Kherson region, and there we saw the Sorok resistance group on the 19th of August reported the blowing up of a car with occupiers, military forces or security forces, 4 of which were killed. A noticeably more violent turn, in particular around the areas where Russia is reinforcing its troops and its equipment. In terms of the last 2 weeks, so that's the 28th of August until the 11th of September, we have at least 12 confirmed operations. Most of them very focused on degrading logistics and communications, so anti-Smersh and Srok in particular. So Srok, it means sort of time's up or deadline in Russian, but it's also a sort of acronym for death to the Russian occupiers and collaborators. For example, in Simferopol district, anti-Smersh said that it destroyed 4 railway relay cabinets, which, heavily disrupts logistics. In Jankoy district, also on the Crimean Peninsula, the Crimean partisans reported hitting an electrical substation. And again, it points to how notable, really, and quite and with some technical prowess, the resistance is able to continue in Crimea, which, of course, since 2022 has been dealing with a rather changed type of occupation. In Zaporizhia region, the Mariupol resistance, in coordination with Ukraine's military intelligence, SOHUR, destroyed a Russian 35th Army command post, which is a very high-value strike with reported officer casualties. Meanwhile, in the Kherson direction, Atesh described a campaign of mining Russian ammunition that disabled, according to them, 60 30 howitzers and ammunition trucks, which would indicate insider access as well as sustained operational pressure. Separately, Srok posts have described various arsons against collaborators tied to profiteering in Henichesk and Skadovsk, both of which are in occupied Kherson region. There were also, various forms of non-violent resistance. For example, most of it takes the form of very selected photographs that show that the resistance groups or the partisan groups are watching. It shows that access is just that constant feeling, in the same way that the Russians,
put in considerable effort, whether it's, through torture, whether or not it's through money or some other form of compromat, to getting people to denounce their neighbours, a tactic well known not only to the Soviet Union, but certainly from the Soviet Union. It's interesting that the psychological war is also played back against them, this sense of, we're inside, you have people, and of course the failure of infrastructures, the failure to pay wages on time, the various problems which we have been discussing even just today in one area, water, in the occupation forces' ability to sort of just provide basic services. They also present opportunities. Not all, people who are involved in the sort of partisan activities we discuss, yes, they're heroes, they're patriots, but not necessarily everybody who's going to provide information will be a patriot. And sometimes the occupation authorities probably do not help themselves. It's just their sheer incompetence and cruelty. So that's a broad overview. Of course, at the same time, we've also seen sort of protests and what we might describe as a sort of form of network building in order, to find out where water is or to deal with the various infrastructure problems. So I would say it's, despite the fact that they're often dismissed, not by you wonderful people on the podcast, but they're often dismissed as sort of, these areas, that's just that now, as if, nothing happens, either because everybody's living in peace, which they very much are not, as we all know, or because, there's just nothing there. Life continues, but life is really, really, really hard, and it's not much of a life at all, is how I would describe it.
Let's move on to our final thoughts. Dom, do you want to start?
3, please, if I may, Adélie. First, thoughts today with our US friends on this 24th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks I mentioned earlier on, but today obviously a significant date in history. So, pals, we are standing with you today. Next, listen to these words. It's increasingly clear the Russian drone incursion into Poland was no mere accident. A new test for NATO has arrived. A reminder this alliance can be undone not just by conquest of land, but by paralysis of will. Inaction may shatter it more swiftly than invasion. I thought it was quite interesting words. From Megan Mobbs, Keith Kellogg's daughter, US envoy, amongst other things. Now, she doesn't speak for her father. She has her own career. She's director of the Centre for American Safety and Security. But I thought it was an interesting observation there. That does sort of sum up, I think, where we are. So do keep an eye. Always worth following Ms. Mobbs there. And then finally for me, just like to say thank you. Got an email from Christopher in New Mexico, United States, who says, following up on a conversation we were having a little while ago, he said, a few weeks ago, another listener and I asked about 3D printing STL files for components needed by the armed forces of Ukraine. I'm happy to report I have found an organisation that manages these sorts of donations by hosting files of in-demand components and collecting the printed pieces for distribution in Ukraine. Please direct interested parties, Christopher says, to Print Army. And that's drukarmy.org.ua/EN. We'll put the link in the episode notes. We were talking some time ago about how the increasing community of people able to, with access to 3D printers, if they wish to, how they could help Ukraine. Well, that is a great answer there from Christopher. So thank you for that. So a bit scattergun, I'm afraid. Adélie, 3 thoughts there, but I thought it was worth bringing to people's attention.
Great, thank you. My final thought very quickly is while you were talking about testing the national alert in the UK earlier on in the episode, I had a quick Google at whether that happened in France recently. So in France, every first Wednesday of the month, there is national testing of the sirens that, similar sirens to the one that you hear in Ukraine when there's an air raid alert. I remember hearing those in school when I was a kid. That happens every first Wednesday of the month, roughly. You don't always hear them, not everywhere. It kind of depends where you are. And on any more pointed exercises for the general population, it doesn't seem like there has been one on the national scale, like there was one on Sunday in the UK. But there have been some localized on like the regional scale. There was one in October 2023, and the latest one was in May 2025, so actually very recently, and that was in an area just north of Paris, L'Oise, and they received similar text messages to the one we had on Sunday. So there's that, but I'll keep on looking into it, see if France has done any other sort of things like that. Joe, do you want to have the last word?
France is quite interestingly, Adélie, is doing a lot to boost its readiness and preparedness for such a sort of catastrophic event like a war. I think in recent months, it's been looking at its hospitals and how the health service in France would react and respond, which I think is quite interesting, but not my final thought. Americans, because of Donald Trump and his sort of flaccid support for Ukraine, get a lot of stick. But actually, if you delve deeper, there's some good things happening, and America hasn't completely walked away from Ukraine. I found a few notifications basically for the approval of foreign military sales to the government of Ukraine. One is for satellite, and this was dated about 2 weeks ago, I suppose, the sale of satellite communication services related equipment for an estimated $150 million. And it's the government of Ukraine has requested to buy an extension of satellite communication services for its Starlink terminals. So do you remember under Biden, the Americans basically brokered a deal to continue funding Starlink without Elon Musk's sort of interference, because there was panic that he was turning on and turning off terminals at different times. I guess the Americans aren't paying for it because it's a sale, but it's happening. Someone is paying for Starlink, whether it's donations to Ukraine. I don't know, Poland's been helping out on that regard. So it looks like Starlink is going to be continued through this American deal. America is ticking along. It sort of demonstrates that the idea of turning American support for Ukraine into a business opportunity. So this one mentions how the Denmark, Netherlands and Norway are financing the missile sales to Ukraine. But turning it into a business opportunity has got America on side, and it is allowing shipments of pretty crucial things that only America can deliver, such as Patriot support. It's got it ticking over nicely. It's stuff that Ukraine really needs, and diplomacy, mainly from Mark Rutte and a few others in Europe. I think Frederick Merz can be credited, Germany's Chancellor can be credited a lot. He's got that support ticking over, and I think that's really important and often goes missed because this is what keeps Ukraine in the fight and keeps its head above water for now.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and in those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest newsletter. Each week, Dom Nicholls and Francis Dearnley answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights. Plus, maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the description to this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app, and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each day on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Phil Atkins. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells and David Nicholls.
My name is David Nicholls. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.